Hello, and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. The Horde as it exists today has a very different vibe and a very different cast than it did back in 2004, to the extent that it doesn't even feel like the same institution anymore. I do think that a similar phenomenon has occurred with the Alliance, and I may make a video on that in the future, but as I am a Horde main and I feel like the problem is far more pronounced with the Horde, we're starting here. The change in the Horde is probably most overt with the fact that only one of its original 4 racial leaders still remains. And that leader is Thall, basically Chris Metzen the Orc, whose purpose in the current story is basically to serve as the token Horde presence. The general trend of the Horde has been to shift away from the gritty, savage, edgy version of the past and towards, well, a Horde that the Alliance would approve of. And surprisingly, when I and others lament this change, I see a lot of pushback on the forums. There are claims that we want to go back to a more evil Warcraft 2 style Horde. And while there are players that probably feel that way, and I don't fault them for that, I don't think they're a majority. It's undeniable that the Horde from vanilla era Warcraft just had very different vibes than the current era. Let's just take a quick glance at the first 6 Horde races implemented in the game, just because chronologically that puts us at the start of Cataclysm versus the next time we got faction-specific races in the BFA pre-order. So obviously we have Orcs, the core of the Horde. This was a race that glorified battle and was often characterized by its war cries. Blood and Thunder, Loktar Ogar, Victory or Death. This was a race that when they needed lumber for their settlements, had no issue with clear-cutting through Ashenvale, and if Night Elves had such a problem with it that they were willing to fight us to the death, so be it. On the slightly more mild side, we had Darkspear Trolls. Trolls carried a very similar air to Orcs, even if they weren't as exaggerated or vocal about it. And they had their own mildly edgy stuff going on, like practicing voodoo, and formerly practicing cannibalism. And then you had tauren, who were the designated gentle race of the Horde, but who would still be able to beat a bear senseless with one of their totems. Their relatively peaceful nature was offset by their sheer size and bestial design. And then of course we had the undead, who while not evil, certainly had looser morals and were willing to do whatever was necessary to survive, including things like necromancy and again, cannibalism. Moving into the Burning Crusade, we got Blood Elves, who were certainly juxtaposed against the rest of the Horde as the prettiest of their races. But when you actually looked at their personalities and their culture, you could see that they fit right in. They were relatively smug, and they widely used the Fel due to the Sunwell being corrupted. Paladins were fully comfortable subjugating the light to their will, and the cinematic trailer for the expansion basically started off with a Blood Elf mana tapping a mana worm to death. And at least at the start of the expansion, the Blood Elves still had a strong affinity for Kael'thas, who had introduced them to the Fel and allowed them to survive the loss of the Sunwell. And then of course we had the Goblins in Cataclysm, who would do pretty much anything for profit without much regard for the consequences to others, and whose technology featured many explosions which were often lethal to friendly characters. I think you can get the picture I'm trying to paint here. The Horde of this era certainly wasn't evil, but they had edge and grit. Yes, it appealed heavily to the mindset of a teenage boy, but why are we acting like that's a bad thing? It feels like over time, all of the races in the game have become increasingly homogenized, to the point that it feels like you're just playing different flavors of human. In my opinion, this decay of sorts definitely peaked in late BFA, but it started a lot earlier than that. And while I could certainly attempt to pore over countless characters to try to illustrate that point, I think I'm going to stick to the racial leaders because by and large, that is how WoW tells its major storylines. And the racial leaders, at least to an extent, are meant to be an encapsulation of the race as a whole. So again, of course, we start out with the Orcs. Thall was our racial leader through Cataclysm, and for the most part, everybody was pretty okay with him. Yes, as an individual, he was on relatively good terms with Alliance characters, particularly Jaina, but it seldom felt like that was getting in the way of his duties as war chief. Although he certainly preferred to avoid conflict when possible, if he needed to throw down against Alliance forces, he was willing to. In Cataclysm, he did step away from the Horde for pretty good reasons. He needed to stabilize Azeroth, acting as the world shaman. In his stead, he left Garrosh in charge. And Garrosh was of course too dictatorial. I appreciate him as a character, and I know there are players who appreciated him as our war chief, but personally I'm willing to accept the narrative that he was a step too far in terms of Horde aggression. So at the end of Mop we depose him, and at the start of WoD he is killed off, and Thall sort of resumes his position as the de facto leader of the orcs, even if not acting as war chief. That is until Legion, where Thall leaves again, this time for what I would consider a bad reason. He had essentially lost his mojo, not being able to even wield the Doomhammer anymore because the elements were sort of rejecting him, and him deeming it more important to spend time with his recently started family out in the Grand in Outland. And I don't want to undersell the importance of family, but Thall, the Horde is your family, and you're basically the granddaddy of it all. Anyway, in his absence, Sourfang serves as the orc leader, though as I went into in my recent video, Battle for Azeroth made him a much less likable character. He was killed off at the end of Battle for Azeroth, and Thall has served as the orc racial leader ever since. But he is absolutely a shadow of his former self. He seems to lead almost begrudgingly. His inability to hold onto a weapon literally became meme-worthy, and his friendly relations with Jaina and Anduin seems to be more prominent than ever. So while we may still have Thall around, he's not really the same Thall. In fact, this is basically a microcosm of the Horde situation as a whole. But not to put everything on him, let's move on to trolls. So we started off vanilla with Vol'jin, who had pretty humble origins. He had been around in the Frozen Throne as a quest giver for Rexxar and company, but at that point he was basically a carbon copy of Sen'jin, his father. And from vanilla through Wrath of the Lich King, he remained pretty unassuming. However, come Cataclysm and Mists of Pandaria, he had a huge glow up. His willingness to talk back to Garrosh while not abandoning the Horde in any way was done very well. And I think most Horde players, at least those who weren't salty about how Garrosh was handled, were pretty ready and willing to accept Vol'jin as war chief at the end of Mop. Which is dang impressive because before then, the war chief of the Horde had always been an orc, and you kind of assumed it just always would be. So trolls were eating really good for about one expansion until they killed Vol'jin off, which was almost downright insulting. He had only been war chief for one expansion and then got killed by a trash mob, seemingly for no good reason other than parody with Varian's death. And what's worse is he was retroactively made to be a fool in his final moments, since they decided to make the spirits that had whispered to him to make Sylvanas war chief actually just be Muzala doing the jailer's bidding. We did see Vol'jin again in Shadowlands, where it was teased that he would take Razan's place as the Loa of Kings, or at least some similar position but endowed with Razan's power. However, it's been 2 expansions since then and many in-game years, and we haven't seen anything come of that. Meanwhile, we have Rokan, who has been serving as the Darkspear leader ever since Legion, and I don't have anything explicitly against Rokan, but considering he was a Warcraft 3 playable character, he's surprisingly forgettable. He ultimately just feels like a diet Vol'jin and hasn't really done anything to differentiate himself. So while I don't love where trolls are at right now, I have to admit that they're not much worse off than they were in vanilla. The same can absolutely not be said about the tauren. Of course, back in vanilla, we had Cairn Bloodhoof kicking around, and I don't think I've ever heard a negative opinion on him. He was wise and of course old, but that didn't really diminish his strength at all. In fact, amongst characters from playable races, he's probably physically stronger than any other one. At least if we're discounting characters who have been souped up by sources of magic. And what happened to this beloved and imposing character? He was killed off in a book. Cairn wasn't a fan of the way that Garrosh was going to lead the Horde, and so challenged him to mock Gorah. And he was seemingly winning that duel to the death, until it was revealed that Magatha Grim Totem had applied poison to Gorehowl, a maneuver that neither Cairn nor Garrosh were too pleased with. Anyway, he was replaced with his son Bane, who I and many others would consider one of the worst characters of the Horde. One of Bane's defining characteristics is just how friendly he is with Alliance characters, and he has a passivity to him that just wasn't there in his father. If you wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, I think you could look at any individual action Bane has taken, and none of them would seem that bad. But it's the culmination of all of them that just paints him as a pathetic leader. He was introduced in the Frozen Throne, where he's captured by Centaur, and you are sent by Cairn to go rescue him. Not the most promising of starts, but let's keep going. One of his earliest actions after becoming chieftain of the Bloodhoof Tauren was to make excuses for Alliance forces who had razed Camp Torajo to the ground, famously citing it as a valid military target, and then going so far as to exile Tauren from Thunder Bluff, who wanted to get revenge for it. He then proceeded to warn Jaden Proudmoore that Horde forces were going to attack Theramore. Now, I will give credit where credit is due. He did do a pretty good job acting as Garrosh's defense lawyer, and it was impressive that he was able to brush his personal grudges aside in order to do that duty. But then we get to BFA, and of course everything is awful here. He vehemently and repeatedly disagrees with Sylvanas' choices, but doesn't actually do anything about it for the longest time. In fact, he only does take action when it involves helping the Alliance. Sylvanas was planning to use Derek Proudmoore as a sleeper agent to take out Jaina and or her mom, and Bane decides that this is wrong, frees Derek, and brings him back to Jaina. When this treachery is discovered, Sylvanas locks him up in the Underhold, and he needs to get rescued again, this time with Alliance help. And infuriatingly, it was at this point that I believe Lorthamar dropped the line that Bane was the best of the Horde. And no, just no, even if you like the guy, he's not the best of the Horde. But then we get to Shadowlands, where he is captured a third time, this time by the jailer, who very quickly determines that Bane is just not worthy, presumably meaning that he wasn't noble enough to infiltrate Elysian Hold and attack Corestria to take her sigil, which doesn't really matter, but it is funny that Zovaal seems to agree with us about Bane as a character. And yeah, Bane does proceed to spend the rest of the expansion sitting on the floor of Oribos, and that was a pretty persistent meme during Shadowlands. Bane just sitting on the airport floor, completely useless. Now, in Dragonflight, Bane actually got his own side story, where he visits the Onaran Plains and is super racist to all the Centaur there. And look, normally I love when my WoW characters are controlled by their prejudices, but even considering the trauma he must have gotten from his first kidnapping, it just doesn't make sense for Bane as a character to act like a jerk to these Centaur who haven't been connected to the Kalimdor Centaur for thousands of years. By the end of the quest chain, he does get over his racism, and he actually gets to go beast mode for once in his life. Bovan Windtotem, who had assisted in his rescue back in Warcraft 3, winds up dead at the hands of the Nokud Centaur. And Bane goes absolutely berserk over it, which, good for him. It's just a shame he never did this to snap any Night Elf spines in half. So yeah, it's just hard to respect the Tauren as a race when their leader seems to exist more so to praise and protect the Alliance than to do anything for the Horde. Moving on, we have the Undead, and oh boy, things are not getting any better. Now, I will admit that even before BFA assassinated her character, there were people who weren't fond of Sylvanas. But still, most players, especially most Horde players, did like her. And at any rate, she was definitely iconic, which is not what we have now. She was edgy, with arguably less than pristine morals, but that's what we liked about her. That's what we liked about the Horde. But of course they capped off her BFA storyline with "The Horde is nothing," promptly ejecting both her and Nathanos from the Horde, with Nathanos serving as a world boss in the Shadowlands pre-patch, where he gets killed off by Tyrande, which just felt like the first of many actions taken to placate Night Elf players. They then proceed to make Sylvanas look like an absolute idiot for trusting Zovaal, and for all intents and purposes kill off her character with the split soul thingy, before subjecting her to Tyrande's punishment of choice, which she obediently carries out like a good little girl. But okay, let me not just get hung up on what they did to Sylvanas. Let's look at what they actually replaced her with: the Desolate Council. First of all, councils in WoW are stupid. They're never actually utilized and seem to exist just to give a semblance of stability. 3/5 of the council are given almost no screen time. You would easily be forgiven for not knowing who Farinel, Belmont, or Velonara are. Then we have Lillian Voss, whose allegiance and investment in the Horde was basically fabricated at the start of BFA. She was originally basically anti-everybody before being used in the Rogue Order Hall in Legion, but the player base was quite audibly confused when BFA rolled around, and she was basically treated like a tenured Horde character. I don't particularly like Voss, and I feel like the main reason she's received relatively well is just in comparison to the final member of the council. I'm speaking, of course, of Kalia Menethil, an Alliance character who was killed off by Sylvanas, brought back to life as a light-infused undead by Anduin and Saara, who towards the end of BFA onwards kind of just started showing up and acting like a Horde character. Not that she had turned against the Alliance at all. In fact, she was still on incredibly good terms with many Alliance characters. It's widely believed that Blizzard intended to make Kalia the new leader of the Forsaken, and only walked that back to a council position once the player base complained about it enough. I find it absolutely hilarious that if you talk to Lillian Voss at the 20th anniversary celebration event, her flavor text literally describes Kalia as being popular with the Alliance. And look, I don't hate the concept of Kalia. In fact, I think there was a lot of potential there. They just didn't do anything good with it. All she's really there for is to help out Alliance characters and give the Forsaken a cleaner look than Plague and Necromancy do. Probably the most insulting part about her was during the Reclamation of Lordaeron quests, where she travels to Maldraxxus and asks Margrave Sindain about the nature of her being brought back. And Sindain turns to the camera and says that any players who have a problem with how Kalia was raised by the light need to just get over it and start accepting Kalia. So in summary for the Forsaken, we replaced Sylvanas of all characters with a council of 3 neglected characters, 1 character who was retconned into the Horde at the start of BFA, and an Alliance character. On to the Blood Elves. I know I shouldn't count Kael as ever having been a Horde character because he wasn't, but he was interesting and edgy, but they killed him off right away. In his stead, we got Lorthamar, who was a complete nobody until the middle of MoP. And he did get fleshed out a little bit in the Thunder King patch. But we also find out that he was literally in talks to rejoin the Alliance before Jaina flubbed that with the Purge of Dalaran. Afterwards, he fell back into obscurity until patch 8.2, where he did a few minor things in Nazjatar, and his entire character since then has been romancing Thalysra, a ship that I am not a fan of and will do a video on in the future. But I suppose overall I would say that Lorthamar is fine as a Horde leader, but that's it. He's just fine. Most of his recent popularity with players has just come from Blizzard leaning into his zaddy status, which I am not at all opposed to, but I do feel there needs to be more substance to his character. Substance beyond being part of Azeroth's hottest new couple. Then we have Goblins, and where do I begin here? I think Blizzard really shot themselves in the foot here, because if they had just introduced Goblins in Cataclysm with Gazlo as their faction leader, everybody would have been cool with it. In fact, most players were really pissed that Galliwix was put in charge. This guy had completely screwed over the player character. And this sentiment persisted for a long time, all the way until Battle for Azeroth. And here comes a very rare moment where I praise BFA's writing. They took Galliwix, who was hated and pretty insignificant, and made him an amazingly fun character to be around. He was such a greedy and goofy character, and I was so proud to have him in the Horde. Talk about an unexpected character redemption. But you know what happened. You knew it couldn't last. As soon as Sylvanas and Nathanos were catapulted from the Horde, Galliwix was next to follow. And they really didn't need to do that. They could have kept him around. But I feel like Blizzard didn't want to because he represented some of the Horde's less than pristine qualities. So they promptly made him make a run for it and replaced him with Gazlo. And the overwhelming majority of Gazlo content we've gotten since then has just been impressing upon us the importance of workers' rights. And to be absolutely clear, I am in favor of workers' rights in real life. Unchecked capitalism is a horrible monster that needs to be kneecapped at every opportunity. But here's the thing. The ethics of your fantasy video game, especially one as whimsical as WoW, do not need to reflect real-life ethics. In fact, that makes it pretty boring. As part of the War Within short story collection, The Voices Within, we got a story focused on Gazlo called The Goblin Way, where Gazlo proceeds to tell Marin Nagenfager that the goblin culture we have known for 2 decades at this point sucks, and that he wants to replace it with a new one that treats workers well and is more focused on long-term profit than short-term. And this was one of the most unpleasant things I have ever had the displeasure of reading. And soon, with patch 11.1, we will be visiting Undermine, where Galliwix serves as the final boss of the raid. And I fully acknowledge that Galliwix makes for a very interesting villain. It just makes me sad that the very expansion where they made him so fun to be around, they decided to get him out of the Horde. And though he may no longer hold the position, it seems quite likely that we'll be killing off yet another Horde leader. Though maybe we'll get lucky and he'll bribe us to keep him alive. So yeah. I've always said that Sylvanas being kicked out of the Horde at the end of BFA hurt me more, but Galliwix being removed was the real "the Horde is dead" moment of realization for me. I'm gonna run through the remaining races a bit more quickly here. For the Zandalari, we had King Rastakhan, who while never officially Horde, basically was, and was super compelling as a character before being killed off 1 patch later. He was replaced by his daughter Talanji, who to her credit is probably the most anti-alliance leader we have right now, but she's just not as compelling of a character, and Blizzard clearly doesn't know what to do with a character who still hates the alliance, seeing as she has had nothing to do since BFA, and they're even reusing her voice actress for Orwena in War Within, suggesting that Talanji won't be showing up again anytime soon. For the Nightborn, we have Thalysra, who was most interesting in Legion when we first met her. Like Lorthamar, I think she's fine, but really hasn't had a lot to do since BFA and is now just part of Azeroth's favorite couple. I will give a minor shout out to Gayara, leader of the Meghar Orcs, who, at least going off of the recent Heartlands novella, is basically how Thrall used to be. But at the end of the day, she's just not a prominent character. And the same could be said of other Horde leaders like G, Mela, Kiro, Cinderthresh. I'd like to factor them in, they just barely have any story presence. And hopefully I've painted enough of a picture for you to see where I'm coming from. The Horde feels vestigial at this point. Heck, the War Chief position doesn't even exist anymore. Instead, we have a council who has done absolutely nothing in the 5-ish years since it was created. And I don't understand why they made it that way. It's not like Horde leaders had absolutely no say under the War Chief system. The obvious answer is that they just wanted to distance the Horde from the bad connotations that War Chief held. But the easiest way for Blizzard to prevent War Chiefs from causing trouble for the Horde is for them to just stop writing them that way. There is nothing inherently wrong with the position, just stop writing Horde leaders as fascists. So, in conclusion, we've been left in a situation where most of the older Horde leadership is either dead or exiled, and the current roster either feel unimportant or are espousing values that fly in the face of a 2004 version of the Horde. Now, perhaps you don't think it's that bad, but imagine for a moment, if you will, a Horde that still has the likes of Vol'jin, Cairn, Sylvanas, Kael'thas, Galliwix, and Rosticon around and interacting, and tell me that doesn't sound like an inspiring and entertaining roster. It has been pointed out by the player base that leading up to patch 11.2, the War Within focuses almost exclusively on Alliance characters. And I'm fine with that in and of itself. A story can ebb and flow who it focuses on. But one also has to wonder if it doesn't have something to do with there not being enough Horde characters around that are worth writing about. After all, as some players have pointed out, Blizzard seems to struggle with writing Horde plotlines that don't involve the faction conflict, and without them being the villains to boot. I'm sure that the Horde will get more focus in the future, but I'm not even looking forward to it at this point. Funnily enough, I think Sylvanas' quote from Reckoning was a harbinger of the future reality. I have no faction pride in the current Horde, just in what existed in the past. The Horde is nothing. For this week's drawing, I decided to go with the character who I feel is most emblematic of the death of the Horde and the rise of the Red Alliance. Bane Bloodhoof. I already spoke plenty of him in this video, so I won't belabor the point further. Aside from me saying that I decided to put him in the Southern Barrens next to the scorched remains of Camp Tarajo, because as far as I'm concerned, that is Bane's legacy. Wow, this was really a downer video, huh? Don't worry guys, I still love WoW, I still love Warcraft, and I still play almost exclusively Horde. It's just sometimes you gotta vent about the stuff you hate, you know? The next video is gonna be a positive one, I swear. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next week. Bye-bye!